Imagine this. You are a frail old man in your 80s or 90s, once a farm labourer, sailor or cart driver, and now seeing out your days quietly in rural Gloucestershire. A swanky car draws up to where you're living, and some well-dressed, well-to-do, cheerful people pile out. You don't know it because they appear to be from another world, but these visitors include an ex-Prime Minister, a well-known novelist, a famous painter, a dashing young concert pianist, and a couple of society hostesses, one of whom is the long-term mistress of the ex-Prime Minister. The pianist, quite a lot younger than the rest, bounds up to you and asks you if you know any songs. You do. Your head has been full of songs for the whole of your life, and you start singing them. Not just to the assembled party, but to a high-tech recording device that you've never seen or even dreamt of before. This scenario may seem a little far-fetched if you try to imagine it taking place in contemporary Britain. Would an ex-PM, a novelist, a painter, a pianist and some posh girlfriends ever be hanging out together, I wonder, let alone visiting doddery folk singers in Gloucestershire? But it's exactly what happened just over a century ago, in April 1908. We're at Winchcombe Workhouse, a few miles north of Cheltenham, in the company of Arthur Balfour, Prime Minister between 1902 and 5, Lady Elcho of Stanway House, the painter John Singer Sargent, and the writer H.G. Wells. The pianist is Percy Grainger, star musical turn of Edwardian London's aristocratic soirees and, with his debonair, fresh-faced enthusiasm, the charismatic Australian eye candy of many a weekend country house gathering. I described Grainger as a pianist here because this was how most people would have known him then, a stylish recitalist and foremost interpreter of the piano concerto by Grieg, whom he'd met and befriended in London in 1906. But Grainger's talents as a composer and arranger were increasingly coming to the fore during the decade or so that he and his mother based themselves in London before their departure to the United States at the start of World War I. And by the time of that Gloucestershire visit in April 1908, Grainger was a seasoned collector of folk songs, effectively in the dual role as self-appointed musical anthropologist and opportunist composer seeking authentically rustic, timeless melodic source material. If it was Lady Elcho's hospitality at Stanway House that facilitated Grainger's so-called folk fishing cruises around Gloucestershire, it was the similar hospitality of the Carey Elwes family at their country seat in Brigg, Lincolnshire, that started Grainger off with Folksong collection a couple of years before that. During the course of 4 separate trips to Brigg in 1905 and 6, Grainger collected over 300 tunes from 60 or more singers, the majority of them men. One of these was the winner of the inaugural Folksong Prize at Brigg's North Lincolnshire musical competition on the 11th of April 1905. Joseph Taylor was a 72-year-old bailiff on the Elwes estate at Brigg, and alongside his winning entry, Creeping Jane, Taylor sang a number of other songs to Grainger, including Brigg Fair. That day, Grainger transcribed it the way that people like Lucy Broadwood, Cecil Sharp and Vaughan Williams were doing at the time, with pencil and paper. On his 4th trip to Lincolnshire in the summer of 1906, he had with him an Edison Bell phonograph and recorded Taylor's singing for posterity on wax cylinder. He subsequently used his clout as a popular recording artist to get the Gramophone Company, later HMV, to make commercial recordings of Taylor singing 9 songs in 1908. The same recording pioneers, the Gaisberg brothers, had caught the uniquely curdled sound of the last castrato, Alessandro Moreschi, in Rome a few years before. Capturing Joseph Taylor on 78 RPM was not quite as remarkable an act of recorded historical preservation as that, but it is a special privilege for us to hear, in this century, the traditional singing of someone who was born in the 1830s. And its influence on the contemporary folk world since a release on vinyl in the 1970s has been far-reaching.
It was on the 5th of August, the weather hot and fair, unto Brigg Fair I did repair, for love I was inclined. I got up with the lark in the morning, with me heart so full of glee, expecting there to meet my dear, long time I'd wish to see.
In May 1906, Grainger brought back to Brigg Joseph Taylor's Brigg Fair in a sumptuously chromatic, unaccompanied choral arrangement. His sophisticated, ingenious and touching arrangements of this and other songs he'd transcribed in Brigg the previous year must have caused quite a stir. The next year, Grainger gave a copy of his arrangement of the tune to Frederick Delius, who subsequently threaded it, Passacaglia-like, through his 15-minute orchestral rhapsody, Brigg Fair. Joseph Taylor was invited to London for the premiere in March 1908, and Grainger observed that the old man became red with pride when he recognised his song on a big orchestra. It may or may not be apocryphal, but Taylor is supposed to have stood up and sung along too. Taylor's presence at that London concert is, I think, telling, because it marks a fascinating blurring of cultural and class boundaries, a meeting of town and country when the two were hugely distinct. A traditional singer from a then relatively cut-off part of England sits in a London concert hall, amidst musically educated figures such as Grainger and Delius, and hears his tune transformed into a piece of complex, notated art music. A certain kind of politically minded musicologist might brand this as cultural appropriation, a kind of stealing from the people. And certainly, if we imagine Grainger with his retinue of distinguished high society hangers-on at the Winchcombe workhouse, the idea of dredging the inmates for their folk tunes, as one of them called it, is potentially distasteful. Was there something inherently condescending and exploitative about all this folk song collection in the early years of last century? The cultured, educated elite breezing into the countryside and saving the lower classes' musical heritage for the nation. The appropriation and incorporation of folk music into art music went further back than Delius's Brigg Fair, Kodai's Dances of Galanta, or Vaughan Williams's Dives and Lazarus variants. Haydn and Beethoven arranged many hundreds of folk songs for publication, not just from German lands but from the British Isles too. Big-hitting Romantic composers, Brahms, Liszt, Dvorak, Tchaikovsky and Grieg, were not oblivious either to the charm and romping energy of local rustic tunes. What was different about all this early 20th century song collection was a dual sense of thoroughness and urgency. They wanted to get to the source, to roll up their sleeves and document this orally transmitted musical culture with meticulous application. And there was a very real fear, at a time of increasing industrialisation, mechanisation and migration off the land, that if they didn't capture these tunes, they would be lost forever. Szymanowski described the alternative community he became involved with in the southern Polish mountains in the 1920s as the emergency rescue squad of Tatra culture. Earlier, in 1907, Bartók and Kodai claimed that traditional Hungarian music was endangered by the influx of light music in the villages and mass-produced imitation folk song. It is high time for us to get down to work, they wrote, to do our patriotic duty neglected so far. Vaughan Williams's motivations for folk song collection too were wider and more idealistic than mere selfish compositional gain. Together with Cecil Sharp, his was a straightforwardly evangelical and local aim to give English folk song a massive rebirth through widespread printed dissemination in schools, to make these tunes, as VW put it, common property again. Is not folk song the bond of union where all our musical tastes can meet? Vaughan Williams wrote in 1932. One day, perhaps, we shall find an ideal music which will be neither popular nor classical, highbrow or lowbrow, but an art in which all can take part. Grainger's own ideal was equally democratic and impressively cosmopolitan. He collected and arranged folk songs not just from around the British Isles, but from Scandinavia, New Zealand and the South Sea Islands. As long ago as 1915, 7 whole decades before Peter Gabriel and friends established WOMAD, the great visionary Grainger wrote what was effectively a blueprint for folk and world music festivals. The article, headed "Let All the World Hear All the World's Music," envisioned an international recording and touring circuit. One programme might consist of Norwegian fiddling, pipe playing, cattle calls, peasant dances and ballad singing, he wrote. another of various types of African drumming, marimba and zanzi playing, choral songs and war dances. And yet another evening filled out with the teeming varieties of modes of singing and playing upon plucked instruments indigenous to British India. This was inspiring, far-sighted stuff indeed, but with a prescient warning too of globalisation's homogenising effect. Grainger noted, "The distressing spectacle of the gentle but complex native arts wilting before the irresistible simplicity of our ruthless Western civilization." I wonder what the 93-year-old Daddy Shepherd or the 83-year-old Archer Daddy Lane made of Grainger's visit to the Winchcombe workhouse in 1908. Was there any sense of social outrage, of being patronised, of feeling like yokel exhibits at a zoo? About their encounter specifically with new technology, Grainger wrote in a Folksong Society article that year that many of the singers he encountered were familiar with gramophones and phonographs in public houses and elsewhere, and all were agog to have their own singing recorded. Perhaps these two ancient Winchcombe residents didn't get to the pub too often. Grainger's letters describe enthusiastic toil on his folk fishing trips, up with the lark, cycling 50 miles or more each day for his musical fieldwork, enjoyable encounters with people he described as big-hearted and amusing, but naturally dirty-handed and filthy, staying up until the small hours transcribing the songs he had taken down. If that is slightly at odds with the spectacle of him turning up at the Winchcombe workhouse in an ex-Prime Minister's grandiose motor car, I think it's important to focus on his apparent respect for these rustic types. The greatest crime against folk song is to middle-class it, to sing it with a white-collar production and other townified suggestions, he wrote in 1952. Crucially, Grainger's notebooks feature affectionate character studies alongside the musical annotations. As his article for Musical Quarterly in 1915 noted, H.G. Wells, who was with me during a folk song hunt in Gloucestershire, on noticing that I noted down not merely the music and dialect details of the songs, but also many characteristic scraps of banter that passed between the old agriculturalists, once said to me, "You are trying to do a more difficult thing than record folk songs. You are trying to record life." I wonder whether Ronald Blythe was aware of this earlier piece of social anthropology when he set out to document rural life in Suffolk for his remarkable book Aikenfield 60 years later. Grainger may not have been the most assiduous of folk song collectors. His was more a fling than a long-term relationship compared with the more deeply committed Cecil Sharp. His use of the phonograph and resulting transcription techniques were controversial at the time and remain so with a band of musicologists who bat their intriguing arguments to and fro. But without those 50 or so days spent in Lincolnshire, Gloucestershire and on a Devon quayside a century ago, we wouldn't have the Taylor recordings. We wouldn't have the dozens of solo and choral arrangements. Lyrical, touching, quirky and brave, inspiration to Benjamin Britten from the 1940s onwards in his own folk song explorations. And we certainly wouldn't have Grainger's 1937 masterclass in colour, counterpoint and harmony for military band, a Lincolnshire Posy. If there's any doubt that Percy Grainger made friends in the fields, homesteads and workhouses of Edwardian England, the dedication in the score says it all about his warm regard and respect for the folk singers he encountered 30 years before. Knowing by then that they were all dead and gone, and living himself in a very different world in upstate New York, Grainger wrote simply and touchingly, "To the old folk singers who sang so sweetly to me."